So I'd like to say thank you to our first panel, thank you to the keynote, our sponsors, and certainly all of you for coming out here on a truly yucky day. So we appreciate your presence today. So in the second panel, we'll focus a bit more on how to respond to the climate challenge. Although, as we heard in the previous panel, talking about the problem that is here and how to respond to it are pretty much inextricably linked. In the previous panel, we heard how Asia is particularly vulnerable to global change. Parts of Asia, this is really an existential challenge. But Asia is looking to be the engine of economic growth going forward, but that could also make Asia the engine of going forward climate change contributions, which is not a position that that region has been in the past. So there's a lot of different interesting things for this panel to discuss, and I'm looking forward to hearing from us. So our first speaker is Dr. Rod Schoonover. He's the founder and principal of Ecological Futures Group. He's also a former high-level official in the U.S. Intelligence Committee and a former professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, a wonderful town. Our next speaker is Brigadier General Joel Vowell. He's Deputy J5 at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in the U.S. Army. And he is also a former federal executive fellow here at Brookings, and we're really grateful to have him back today. And on the far side of the stage, our final speaker will be Dr. Hiroshi Ota. He's a professor at the School of International Liberal Studies at Waseda University. So, Rod, I'll give the stage to you for your opening comments.
Thank you, and thank you for coming out on, as was mentioned, a yucky day. I don't know if it's still raining and sleeting, but it was when I walked in. And thanks to Brookings for hosting this event. So normally I'm on the first panel, which is bringing the bad news, and especially being a former U.S. intelligence officer, that's a comfortable place to be. And so I think the first panel did a really excellent job on describing the national security overtones of climate change. I would mention, just for people who are walking in, security really spans human security, national security, and global security, and sometimes those are intermingled. I also think it's important that we take note of some things that aren't always seen as climate change effects and really call them out as such. For example, the things that aren't normally captured in a meteorological framework. So, for example, rise in animal and plant extinctions, redistribution of plant and animal life on Earth, especially in the marine systems that are important to the Asia-Pacific, desynchronization of ecological processes that may have economic effects. Certainly, the risk of an overexpression of rapidly evolving or rapidly reproducing species such as algae. Algal blooms are a giant problem developing, especially where temperatures are already high. And of course, we just heard in the last panel about the Tibetan Plateau. There's a whole range of mountain phenomena such as slope instability and glacial lake outbursts that should rightly be seen as climate effects. And I'm even going to pull back the aperture just a little bit more because if we're pivoting towards looking at solution spaces, we need to talk more than just climate change. So, for example, I'm a scientist by training, so I tend to think of things in a scientific framework. But if you pull the camera back, climate change is one of multiple anthropogenic stressors to the planet. So in addition to changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere that leads to greenhouse gas effect and ocean acidification, we're also loading it with aerosols that have an adverse effect on human health. And we're disrupting geochemical cycles such as nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen, for example, leading to nitrogen overloading in the oceans that leads to eutrophication, leads to hypoxia. Land system changes such as deforestation, especially in the Pacific context, mangrove clearing is very impactful. And then there's a whole set of ocean stresses, as I mentioned before, acidification, there's stratification, there's pollution, there's debris, and also freshwater stress from overpumping of groundwater and also infrastructure development like dams. I bring these up because if you're looking at what to do in the 20, 30 years where you can bend the trajectory by greenhouse gas emission reduction policies, you have to really look at vulnerability and you have to look at adaptation. And working on those other more direct, less lag time anthropogenic stressors gives you a way to reduce the vulnerability. And there's also a whole set of other social and political stresses that are affecting not just Asia, but the world. Income disparity, governance challenges, misinformation and disinformation. And I think it's important to see these holistically, because if you're going to tackle vulnerability and increase the ability for humans to successfully adapt to what are increasingly certain trends in temperature and precipitation changes, then I think you have to look outside of the traditional, certainly the greenhouse gas emission reduction policy, which is crucially important, but there are other parts important too.
Absolutely. That was terrific. You know, I think I'll ask you a follow-on question now before we move on down the line. I really appreciate your focus on multiple natural systems and how these systems can really compound the problem of climate change. Of the kinds of effects that you've described, which of those do you find most important in the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly coastal and island areas?
That's a hard question because Asia is so big. Certainly, if you're looking at Indonesia, biosphere instability is a serious issue. But just more broadly, I really worry about ocean stress. And really, it's not just one, it's the multiplicity of stresses, right? It's not just the acidification from the absorption of carbon dioxide, and it's not just the stratification and the freshification, if that's a word, from melting ice. It's also the direct pollution, the pharmaceuticals that mimic endocrine action in organisms. Microplastics. Again, this is not a word that you normally hear in a national security conversation. Why is that? I don't know, but we just never really talk about something that has such a critical effect on the fisheries on which so many people in Asia depend. So it seems to me that the suite of stresses on the ocean, on which we have very little levers, right? I mean, I'll bring the bad news. There's so little we can do to offset temperature changes in the ocean since it has taken on so much of the thermal spillover from global warming. And so I think that's one of the things that worries me. We don't, we can address illegal fishing, we can address pollution, we can address some of these other more direct anthropogenic stresses, but I do worry about acidification. I do worry about stratification and changing circulation patterns.
Thank you. Although it's a difficult message to hear that our challenges with the ocean don't just stop at sea level rise and direct climate effects. So General Val, I'd like to pass it off to you.
Well, thanks. To Brookings in general, as a recidivist repeat offender who was here from 16 to 17, I learned from a lot of national treasures here, so it's always a pleasure to come back and participate. I'm a 28-year Army officer now at the Indo-Pacific Command Deputy J5 for Strategic Planning and Policy. And you might be kind of curious, why would an active duty officer be up here talking about climate change impacts? Well, I will tell you, using an old Soviet maxim, you may not be interested in climate change, but climate change is interested in you. So let me talk strategically about the region, if I may, because it's going to tie together with, I think our panel is really focused on what's happening now, but what we can do or think about for the future. And I think at Indo-Pacific Command, we deal with some of these all the time. So in the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, we talk about 5 stated threats to vital national security: Russia, DPRK, China, violent extremist organizations, and Iran. In our command, 4 of those 5 exist every day. 3 of those 5 are nuclear, and not in a good way. 2 of those 5 are existential threats to the United States of America and our allies, just in the nuclear arsenal alone. So I think about that a lot. But also stated in those documents are the disasters. We live in a region where 80% of the world's volcanoes and earthquakes happen. Yesterday in the Philippines, 6.8 magnitude earthquake hit the Philippines. This happens every day in the region. Typhoons, other disasters that have been talked about in consequence management from eloquent speakers before me, happens all the time. So we're kind of, I would say, practiced in consequence management, disaster response, and humanitarian assistance in the region. We get better every day. But that's some of the stuff that we see. So I mentioned PRC, a competitor, geostrategic competitor to the global world order. Make no mistake. Make no mistake about that. But they're also affected by climate change. You saw the statistics that most of the people in their country live on the eastern seaboard of their own country, and are also going to be affected in the near term by rising sea levels. But here's what I see when I go forward and talk to different military counterparts, whether it was in the Maldives or in other island nations. And that first island chain in the Pacific, from Japan down through the Philippines and down to Indonesia, Straits of Malacca, that first island chain, they'll tell you what I just told you. Their threats are a competition with China and their pernicious influence that they're trying to achieve. When you get up to the second island chain, to the COFA states, the CNMI, and to the Vanuatus and the Tuvalu and Fiji and Tonga and et cetera, those island nations as described that have their highest point 7 to 10 feet above water, they think it's fascinating that we have this competition right now with China. What really fascinates them is they won't exist in 10, 20, 30 years. And they tell us, in all seriousness, we have a challenge. And then you go to a Chief of Defense conference, which I was at in August of this year in Bangkok. And the Chief of Defense for Papua New Guinea says this is an issue for his country. Not that his country is directly being affected so much, but they are in receipt of climate change migrants. And they're having to deal with that effect. And so you've got this spectrum now of the acknowledgement of the impacts that are happening in the region. So what do we do in Indo-Pacific Command and the DoD writ large? I mentioned there's been a lot of activity for years because the region has been just prone to that for eons and epochs. But with the advent of more climate change impacts, the more we do with disaster management, the more we do with HADR exercises for interoperability, cooperation, knowledge sharing, and capacity building, the better off we are. You may be surprised in the audience that we exercise with the People's Republic of China's Army, Navy, and Air Force a couple times a year. It's not combat operations we practice. It's humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and disaster management. That is a common challenge to all. It's also a good way to continue collaborative discussion and dialogue to make sure human safety and security is met the best we can. My department deals a lot with consequence management, less proactive mitigation policies. That's up for other instruments of power. I'm but one in the military. There's diplomatic, information, economic, legal, et cetera. Those policies have to be put in place on what specifically to do. But I will tell you, it's affecting my partners, my allies, when we go talk about security in the region. Here's a last little vignette for you, and I'll pass off the mic. So is the audience aware about 2-3 weeks ago, tiny little island nation of Tuvalu turned away $400 million from the PRC? You know what the PRC was going to do with that money? Build them abatements and offshore jetties to make sure the rising sea levels could keep that at bay from the islands themselves. So think about this. I just talked about an existential threat to these island nations that have a very small height that one good tidal wave might take them off the map. And they turned away an offer of aid. I will tell you there's going to be more stories like that going in the future, because with the PRC, there's always some sort of string attached. So there's a country that understands the values of what the PRC is bringing, which are not necessarily good, and they come with those strings, but they still have that problem. We've got to be able to address that in the future. We find common values in allies and partners in ways that our competitors can't, for a liberal, open international order and a free and open Indo-Pacific. But that also requires us to be responsive to their needs in new ways that, from a security standpoint, 28-half-year veteran who's focused on killing bad guys and their stuff to keep us safe and secure, we have to think about those in different ways. And with that, I will yield.
I'm not going to let you give the mic back just yet. I hear you saying, I hear a couple of different stories coming about with respect to probably our biggest geostrategic challenge, which is China. On the one hand, you're talking about some things that they're trying to do geopolitically to help the small island states. But on the other hand, there are these bits of cooperation in terms of dealing with disaster response. Could climate change slightly open the door to greater cooperation between us and our greatest geostrategic partner, or is this likely to become another area where we have challenges and are more at odds? Am I being too positive, or is there a slight sunny spot in here?
Again, I'm a general officer, not a specific officer, so I'm generally knowledgeable on subjects and not very specific. So otherwise, I'd be known as a specific officer. Let me answer the question. I think it's both. So I think we talked about the Arctic earlier and at lunch. One of the biggest challenges to China's attempt to go into the Arctic is they have to compete with Russia, who claims it as their own. And that's an interesting geopolitical discussion, where China you don't think of as a member of the Arctic Council, because they're not. They want to be. And why is that? Resource exploitation, resource exploitation, resource exploitation. That's it, kids. So that creates its own challenge. That is an effect of climate change. The receding ice and the open passageways that we all think are coming and are being seen now, is going to create that space. That is going to be an interesting place to actually work with other partners, allies, and competitors when those things happen. But you also mentioned impacts to humanity, and I think that is an opportunity for everyone in the region to come together. Again, our strategy, our policy is great power competition, not great power hatred. Okay, this is not about denying China everything on a strategic national level scale. That's not it. I'm not here to tell you that. Our government wants a China that rises in the safe, rules-based order that we allowed them to grow in for the last 40 plus years. That's what we want. So there's opportunity in space. I'm optimistic as well, not naive. I'm optimistic that those wedges and seams can be filled with cooperation. We do that, like I said, those disaster management exchanges. And as I mentioned to the group at lunch today, Operation Cobra Gold exercise every year happens in February in Thailand. There's 28 nations this year. India and PRC were observer nations this year. They're going to participate this February. They're participating in the humanitarian assistance disaster response exercise. Why? Because we want to remain interoperable, even with people we compete with, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that. And I'm always looking for whatever little cracks of light come through on an issue like this. Dr. Ota, the stage is yours, and your slides are to you.
I can see the slides, but not. Oh yeah, here comes. My name is Hiroshi Ota and came from Japan, and also want to be a part of good allied partner with the United States. And also coming from the Asia countries, Japan is also very vulnerable countries. I'd like to show first two slides how Japan is vulnerable. Yeah, this is from IPCC's most current fifth assessment report. And Japan, in absolute term and relative term, is the most vulnerable. Yeah? And this is kind of a year from 1998 to 2009, and then most vulnerable or most hit by the extreme weathers, and then most damages in absolute term, meaning that exposures of populations to the extreme weather, over 30 million people, just followed by Philippines, China, India, and most of them are Asian countries. But for the relative term, it's mostly Pacific Island nations. This is quite interesting. And again, for absolute term in economic loss for the GDPs, Japan is number one, and then followed by China and Korea. This is because of the economic size. But again, relative size, most of them are Pacific Islanders. So this is quite interesting how kind of significant or how vulnerable the Pacific Island countries, and also how vulnerable Japan in terms of physically population size affected and also economic damages. And again, this is the most current, the so-called Global Climate Risk Index. This is German Watch NGO group. Again, Japan is the number one. This is an annual base. So last year, we had a major typhoon hit major city in Osaka. So lots of damages. So in terms of the death toll, and then deaths per 100,000 people, and absolute loss and relative loss, Japan is ranking very high, so becoming number one, and then followed by Philippines and Germany. So this is the quite vulnerable situation in Japan, facing lots of typhoons coming hit now. Even this year, Tokyo hit quite hard area typhoons. But kind of an interesting question, but puzzling. Not so many major ministries, governmental branches are concerning about climate change as a threat, not even using the climate securities. Only the environment ministries use the climate securities and issued a particular report on climate securities, but not for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, not the Department of Defense. Partly because they do not want to use securities, because it's a very sensitive term in Japan, and particularly for defense force, self-defense forces. We don't say defense forces. Self-defense forces now, main mission is disaster relief at home. Maybe that would be happier for the Koreans and Chinese people, providing some secure sense of security to the neighboring countries. But anyway, so maybe Dr. Goodman should go to the Japanese Defense Ministry to lecture how this climate change and security should be connected. But anyway, so there's not so interesting, but they try to be very much disaster relief activities is very important for their missions. So that most of the ministries and then government think the Japanese international cooperation agencies can play a major role in terms of addressing global climate change in the sense of providing the mitigation policies and adaptation policies. So these are the kind of one example, and I'm not going in detail, but Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, the year 2017, spending 787 billion, which is about the 7.1 billion US dollars, and then for mitigation and adaptations. These are some concrete the projects, and also 14 countries for the Asian countries, and then 6 countries in the Pacific regions. They're providing some kind of mitigation adaptation, the kind of the assistance. So one of the priorities is promoting low carbon societies, and then resilience buildings and urban development. And another priority is kind of enhancing the countermeasures and also supporting climate policy and institutional development, and also addressing the ecosystem preservations and working with international organizations. So this is quite a low profile, but this is maybe Japanese government is trying to address the problem of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I'd like to ask you, I think we sometimes forget Japan is definitely not a small island nation. It's the largest economy in the region, but there's certainly an island nation nonetheless. Are there lessons that the island nations in the Pacific can learn from Japan's response to climate change?
Yes, I think we don't see the climate change as a major threat, but maybe every year we're facing lots of extreme weathers recently. So we have kind of a preparedness plan, how to prepare, and then providing early warning. So before typhoon hits or hurricane hits, government and also local government is sending the warning messages. And even local police and also local township member door to door, and helping to elderly and disabled people to be able to escape. But still, major floods and coming recently, and then we still lose some lives. But still try to be, be ready. And also, not only typhoon or extreme weather, but as you know, earthquakes is a major problem. So recently, the public broadcasting in Japanese NHK had a 1-week series of the how to prepare when major earthquake hit Tokyo area, mega cities. So there's a kind of showing us very disastrous scenes. And then for 10 days, there's no supply of waters, electricity, how to survive. So those kind of things coming up nowadays, even for the flooding and typhoons. But unfortunately, it's not enough. Still, we're losing lots of, I just saw that quite large economic losses and also human loss.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Japan has quite a bit of experience in disaster response.
That's a good experience.
Yeah. Useful, but not the kind of experience you necessarily want to have. So I'd like to start the Q&A period overall by posing a question to all of our panelists. You all come from slightly different positions, which could make this an interesting question for you each to answer. But I'm curious how the cross-Pacific relationship, the relationship between the United States and Canada, Mexico, across to the Pacific, how that can be leveraged to help Pacific nations, and particularly the less developed Pacific nations, deal with their climate issues? How can we leverage, what can we bring to the table in order to help our friends and allies across the ocean? And I'm open to whatever order you all would like to answer that in.
I'll start. So I just returned from the conference, American Geophysical Union, so I'm going to put on my science hat instead of my former intelligence officer hat. I actually think that, and piggybacking on a couple things that have already been mentioned about early warning, I think this is a place where a lot of fruit is left to be picked in terms of not just early warning, forecasting the weather longer into or further into the future, but also while I was there, I saw efforts into nascent ecological forecasting, helping to forecast the health of certain critical ecosystems into changing climate conditions. The second largest, the country with the second highest number of attendees was China. They are a critical part of filling in scientific knowledge that's quite specific to Asia. I think a lot of researchers bring a flavor of their own country or their own region into their own research. Japan was another very large attendee, so was Thailand. I think the science to science linkage, especially if it is, if it's, the word goose came into my mind. If it's goosed by governments, it's lubricated. Is that the right word?
Sure.
Okay.
Encouraged.
Encouraged, thank you.
Nurtured.
Nurtured. I think can bear a lot of fruit. And so, again, I think there's so much dividend, there's so many dividends from this ecological forecasting, maybe even dipping into sociological forecasting. If we can get a handle on migration patterns well before they're established, that would be a real benefit to the security and policy world.
Yeah, just a couple adds that while I was thinking about the question, again, not a subject matter expert by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a couple fora that exist where there are opportunities. One's ASEAN, and the subcommittee is really for ASEAN that would probably be best addressed. Multiple nations involved, but that's aspirational. We have challenges in ASEAN, in my opinion, with just things like the Code of Conduct for the South China Seas, where UNCLOS is going, where recommendations are going. But there's also the Pacific Islands Forum, so the PIF is another opportunity. There's about 4 dialogues with Pacific Island nations throughout the year that have different countries involved, some from East Asia, some from North and Latin America. So I think those are venues to have the dialogue discussion going forward about what to do. The last thing I'll leave is what was impressive to me in this last assignment and now this one is just how involved academia and other institutions and NGOs, PBOs are involved in the region in ways I didn't know. So, for example, University of Hawaii has a huge outreach program across the region. As an example, and there are many others, that just from a common operational picture of operations, activities, and influence across institutions, they and others, University in Australia, Sydney is involved, and some others in what we call the Lower Pacific, they would call Northern Pacific, to have this dialogue and discussion for mitigation and response. We specifically get involved in building partner capacity with things like maritime domain awareness, with sonobuoys, with equipment to help primarily those Pacific Island nations deal with the IUU, illegal, unregulated, unreporting fishing issues, and also just to maintain their economic exclusive zones outside their 200 nautical miles. But that's a venue as well to make sure we can bring those issues up. Other than that, I don't have any better policy prescriptions.
I'm not representing Japanese government, so I like to speak for the people-to-people relationship. I think Japan and Korea should cooperate more, and because in ASEAN +3 and also Pacific Island Forum, I think Japan can, and also together with Korea, can really become effective, the facilitators to promote all this international cooperation. It's very difficult to work with China, as JP mentioned, but quite competitive, strategically competitive. But unfortunately, today's not so government relationship between two countries is not so positive and very negative. But I think for the future, talking about North Korea's issues and climate change issues, and particularly energy transition, we should have some kind of international transmission network with Korea and Japan and Taiwan. That will be helpful to address mitigation and also maybe help for adaptation. So I think confidence buildings is quite important, I guess. First, we should kind of how to build trust among the neighboring countries. I think this is fundamentally very important to me. And then we can further work on the climate change issues. So this is my kind of take.
Thank you. I think it's probably a good time to open it up for questions. In fact, I see people jumping the gun and raising their hands. So let's get the mics out there. There's a question right here from this gentleman in the third row, and I'd like to take 3 of them, and then we can pose them across the row. You can choose what to answer or not.
Thank you. I'm Piotr, thematic specialist with Amnesty. My question was initially going to be towards the ambassador, but perhaps it's better suited here. Something that's obviously, as one of the younger generational people, we've got Greta, and is the idea of, grassroots initiatives. But my question simply is, what do you think the role of social media is? And also, a sub-question, but related, is unfortunately the UK decided to re-vote in a rather populist leader, and he represents a few other leaders around the world, such as Bolsonaro, who are heavily influential in how much we can actually produce national strategies to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And I just want to hear what you think we can do to respond to climate change with the idea of populism as a barrier. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Winters, independent consultant. Since we have a voice from Japan here, I'd like to see if you could clarify something I've heard. But my understanding is that it's either the southernmost or maybe the southeasternmost point of territory, the Japanese territory is a little speck in the water, which is sort of sinking under the water. And if it disappears completely, then this issue of what is the the economic zone and so forth, and afterwards, and so this issue also arises for major powers, and actually. An international lawyer from Singapore said to me once, and this is probably not the case, but I like your idea on it if you have one. He said, one of the reasons that you don't hear Japan criticizing China for its artificial features that they're building in the South China Sea is because Japan, in a sense, is pouring all this concrete on their little place, and it's going to end up to be an artificial feature. But they want to continue to have it count.
Someone here on this side in the yellow skirt.
I'm Lucy Mines with the Asia Bureau at USAID, and I'm curious how you think about the competing need. Asia is meant to be an economic engine. Economic engines are based on consumerism. Consumerism has a significant impact on climate change, as does urbanization, which is also a major factor in Asia. So with you have those forces, how can you work around them to address some of the issues that you've already raised about the climate change impact?
Thank you so much. We have three great questions. One about how to deal with climate change in a world that's becoming more populist. One, and let's expand it not to just Japan's maritime boundary, but as islands are perhaps sinking, how will we think about maritime boundaries in the future? And then one of how do you combine Asia as an economic engine and the economic growth and perhaps increase in climate emissions that involves. And so you can answer as many or as few as you'd like, but I'll just start it down the row. Should I start at the other end to change things up a little bit? Yeah. Would you like to begin?
Three of them is quite difficult questions to answer. For the territorial issue, the small island, Minami Torishima, is one of the islands you mentioned, maybe. Government is building up the concretizing the island, not kind of avoiding to become submerged into the sea. So of course, the EEZ is one of the most concerned, and then not only island territory, but also fishing ground surrounding this. So economically and strategically, very important to maintain this island. So I think Japanese government tried to striving for the maintaining this island, but not because of these island issues. Japan is not kind of taking a strong stance against Chinese expansion of the South side in China Sea. Maybe different issue, I guess, different dimension. But certainly, this very much concerned about this. Japan's government is very much concerned about territorial issues with regard to the climate change. The question about populism and how to kind of raise awareness and also try to mitigate climate change is also a very difficult problem. But just maybe introducing a very small, concrete example how to kind of deal with is that economic matter is quite important. And for example, Japanese government has been criticized by the international communities still maintaining coal power plants projects, even try to build new ones. But international financial institutions like institutional investors, even Norwegian institutional investors divesting money from the coal power plants related companies' activities. So in this way, not directly addressing populisms, but in this way, maybe kind of economic incentive, disincentive can change the behaviors. So I think somehow addressing more the immediate short-term interests to thinking about the long-term solution of climate change may be one of the approach to deal with this kind of rise of populism. Yet we can pursue the mitigation policies. And the engine of Asia as an economic engine, and then how to address urbanizations is quite fundamental questions to, I think, not only Asian countries, but also other American continents and others. But I think one of the kind of broad answers to your question is sustainable societies is one, sustainable community buildings, and also maybe younger generations is not necessarily for the older generations kind of pursuing the material wealth. So they are more kind of economics and then also not pursuing the material wealth, but also more qualitative quality of life they are pursuing. So maybe lifestyle is changing, and then many urban dwellers in Japan feeling tremendous fear of when we have major disasters. So maybe they are thinking about going to the local areas and maybe changing the urbanization plan to the more kind of a compact city type of cities. We can have public transportations, and then everything is walking distance. Those kind of maybe new urbanization plan should be one of the way to change the urgent problem we're facing today, but not so overnight solutions we can provide for you.
Okay, I'm going to try to go real quickly. To the gentleman up front, I'm an instrument of national policy. I won't get into politics, but I will say this. I'm a little more optimistic, and it comes down to education. I'm a child of the 1970s and 80s public school education in America, very different from my father's generation when we grew up in the conservation movement. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, et cetera, et cetera. I grew up with that. So it's ingrained in me to personally, and my generation in the military as well have got this in our DNA, that we just don't throw oil down the drain, and we actually try to treat the environment a little bit with some respect. Much more than we did before, not good enough. I've got a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old. They're screenagers. They have to have a screen in front of them. They communicate through social media. They do, but that is extremely impactful, and it's a mobilization for mass movement, if you will. My fear is that you got to have the right education platform to do that. I say fear. My concern is there's a lot of easy ways to disinform society that way, or gravitate to what you think is your preconceived notion for something, and that's all I'll say about that. But I'm not pessimistic about which leadership of which country now is going to stop all movement. I look at my sons who, I do want to leave it better than I found it for them, but they're not waiting. And I think that's your generation. You look like you're under 30. So I think they're going to move out on that. I think they're going to surprise us. I'm optimistic that way. Artificial features. Let me counter a couple things here. There is a vast difference between the dubious territorial claims by the PRC in the South China Seas, the Spratlys and the Paracels, Fiery Cross, Mischief Reef. 2016 Court of Arbitration for UNCLOS found in favor of the Philippines. Who listened? Not the PRC. They don't give a damn. That's not their territory. We gave that to, quite frankly, the Republic of China when we supported Chiang Kai-shek, the 9-, now 10- line. That's territory, not the seas. But as we all know, 200 nautical miles for an exclusive economic zone impacts Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the PRC, all in the South China Seas, and they're all in competition with that space. What Japan is doing is maintaining sovereignty that's not in contest, and territorial integrity, which they should do. That's why nobody's really talking about that. But you go down the street here at CSIS or in this building and show you open source pictures of the militarization of the South China Seas. That is a totally different issue. And while I'm on it, speaking of conservationism and ecological protection, the worst coral disasters and sand plumes in the world are happening with all the construction by China in the South China Seas. They have debrided coral features and ecological systems en masse that are not coming back, just to put airfields and revetments and missiles out in the middle of the ocean. That's a challenge. I have nothing to say on consumerism and urbanization other than I realize that those are true. And so if you have a less materialistic society, sustainable infrastructure, British author named Matthew Ridley talked about this a while ago in a couple books, but he's more the rational optimism about developing societies. I don't know enough to know more than that. I think that that is a factor, and you're absolutely right, and they're in competition with what could be causing climate change.
I'll be quick. A lot of what I had to say was said before. I think the grassroots movement, because that's the first part of your question, can only be seen as a positive thing, especially currently. I do have a concern that if tactics became more militant, that it would be painted as in a different light. And so, and the second part of your question was about social media. And like a lot of things, maybe like most things, maybe like everything, nothing is purely good or purely bad. And social media, you know, in my mind, it's about 50-50 right now. I'm generally very concerned about information integrity. It goes into the education question that was brought up earlier. How do people know what's true? So, you know, one of my big heroes in science was Carl Sagan, and he talked about science as a candle in the dark. And I think when scientific knowledge, scientific integrity is challenged, not just by social media, but that seems to be a new engine that those of us who have been following climate change for decades, this is a new thing, or at least a new element. I am worried about that. In terms of competing needs, I don't have much to say on EEZs any more than what you've already heard. But in terms of competing needs, that's a great question. And of course, a USAID officer would really pick up on that very quickly because it's a tension that's built in to our modern society. And I actually think that if you run the 20th century again, knowing what we know now, right, would we optimize a multidimensional problem over one variable? Which means, would you run agriculture so that you maximize your yield without regard to what you're doing to soil? Would you catch as many fish as possible without looking at the long-term integrity? That's kind of what we do. And so I actually don't see urbanization and I'm sure you don't either, in a negative light. I actually think it's a cultural engine and a political governance engine that we really need to tap into. But it's also the site of a lot of vulnerabilities that are emerging because we're not updating our infrastructure. We probably need to rethink infrastructure completely. Because if we're building things that are going to allegedly last for 50 to 100 years, that's probably not a strategy when we're not looking at a stability point anytime soon. So we may need to think of resilience in not as opposed to disposability, but circularity. So it's good for for about 10 years, and then we do it again and do it again. That's the way nature adapts, by little iterations with stress.
Thanks. And I like the question about populism a lot, so I'm actually going to take the moderator's prerogative and say a couple of words too. And we're really seeing a lot of that in the world right now, and it's something I've thought about a lot in my own work. Not just populism, but anti-globalization, anti-multilateralism. We're seeing that happen in a lot of places in the world right now. And the cure isn't the right word, but the antidote to this, I think, is a youth population that really cares. If you're a populist and you're coming out and saying, I want what the people want, and what the people want is climate action, then that's helpful. The anti-globalization is a bit harder to work with, but if you have a constituency that really wants action, that really wants resiliency, that really wants a greener energy system, politicians listen to that. And so I think we go back to, I'm a child of the 70s as well, and the environmental movement was quite different then than it was now. But on the other hand, we were brought up to care about certain things, and then I see younger people today who look at them completely differently and care about them to a completely different degree. They're starting to think about things like circularity and not having a throwaway culture, and we are approaching things differently. And I think as that generation grows up, votes, that will help politicians respond to the people that they represent. So that's an optimistic view, but you got to be optimistic about something. So on that note, I'd like to take some more questions. This gentleman.
Last questions.
Okay, last questions, he says.
Lightning round.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Grayson. So I have a question. So without measurement, we have no management. Without management, we can't have mitigation. So I'm curious what all of your thoughts are on the emergence of technologies such as 5G, AI, supercomputing, GIS technologies, and how these can influence how we study and understand how the environment is changing and how we can use these technologies to address these changes. And if you can give maybe at least one specific example of what you've seen, how these technologies are being used. Thank you.
Back here in the back row, and then the gentleman in front of him.
Yes, Emmanuel Pastrais from the Asia Institute. I had a question, and the question of, say, fossil fuels and mitigation, I guess what I was sort of hoping was someone would say, we'll stop using coal and oil by such and such a date. And particularly in the case of the military, which is a relatively controlled economic system, it's actually possible in a way you can't do in other sectors to say, we'll go to electric within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And I was curious in terms of what your thoughts were in terms of how, particularly the military, could serve as sort of the vanguard in terms of absolute mitigation. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. My name is William. I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I had a question for all three of you, I suppose. I just spent the last couple of months in Beijing and all around different parts of China. And one of the things I've noticed there is that, while there is a really, really big effort to, to be switching to renewable energy, to be, increased recycling, there does remain in China and in a number of different countries around Asia and the Pacific a kind of a stigma that renewable energy efforts and environmental conscientiousness is kind of a force pushed by Western powers, pushed by industrialized nations onto countries such as China, India, Vietnam, and so on. That why do these countries get to pollute so much, having already done so, having already industrialized, whereas with countries like China and India, who are now going through the process of their industrialization, now being forced to do it in a very restricting way. So is there a way around this, and is there a way to promote industrialization and economic growth in these countries that doesn't compromise renewable development? Thank you.
Excellent. 3 more good questions. How is new technology influencing our understanding of the environment? Can the military be in the vanguard of moving away from fossil fuels? And is this push for climate action against fossil fuels an imperialist ploy coming from the West? So
I'll just start, because I have short answers. I think the tech piece of this is really the only way out. especially with early warning and forecasting. We're here talking about this because of remote sensing. We would have this problem that we didn't really have a handle on, and we would just be vulnerable to all of these climate effects if we didn't have a deep understanding of how the Earth system works, and that is largely from remote sensing. And so, although I do worry about 5G and the overlap between some of the hydrological spectra, I think 5G, and I think especially AI, as a interpretive tool in detecting early warning, I think is probably invaluable. Military should decarbonize as quickly as they can, and they should use mill-to-mill engagement to help other militaries decarbonize as quickly as possible. That's the only correct answer, in my opinion. And China and other Asian countries, other developing countries, are unfortunately also some of the most vulnerable. We will, the worldview, climate change is part of the worldview at this point. It's no longer a niche topic when I started looking at it. People are more ready to identify things as climate change. And I actually think some of these effects that happen in Asia will be very quickly seen as climate effects. Now, I don't understand China internal politics well enough to know whether that has any effect on its direction, but I think it's an interesting question.
I'll take the technology question from a different angle. We in the department are optimistic about the character and future of conflict changing, and we see that today with machine learning, inroads to artificial intelligence. And if I could just project there, if you try to war game today with a bunch of people in a room and think about action, reaction, counteraction in a scenario, it might take a couple hours to figure out what's the best course of action. What if I could do 10,000 emulations in less than 2 seconds? So if I had that technology capability, bunches of algorithms, cross-queuing that could tell me where to be predictive, what best course of action country X could take for climate change abatement, et cetera, that might be helpful. It would also be apolitical, I'd offer. Alternative fuels, you might be surprised. I know I speak from the Army's side. There's other investments in the other services, but there's an Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Environment, and Energy, IE&E. And their charge is to do, I don't know the goals, I would be lying if I told you percentages, but their goals are to reduce those kind of carbon footprint emissions. So there's a lot of solarization on installations across Kona specifically. If you go to Fort Knox, Kentucky, if you go out to Fort Bliss, if you go to Fort Campbell, there are solar fields that didn't exist 5-10 years ago that are starting to replace the energy that's coming from other sources, carbon or other base sources. That's a step in the right direction. We've had a nuclear navy for a while, so that's been helpful for decades. And we don't recommend anybody else become nuclear, at least for weapons. I can't speak to the stigma. I would just say that if I understood the question correctly, I don't get my chance to rise up and industrialize, but you did, and you caused all these problems, then yeah, I would be kind of pissed about that too, but go ahead.
For the technological question, I think you already heard some answers, but I think I raise one kind of negative aspect of the using of technological development. Japan is very much famous of the energy efficient technologies. So because of energy efficiency, we use more house appliances, more refrigerators, more the washlet with toilet, special, the features of the using more energies in total. So this is kind of the negative byproduct of the using energy technology, efficient technologies. For the last question, how to address the industrializations, particularly emerging economies, being able to less environmentally harmful development if possible. I think the two ways, one positive ways of developed countries show to the developing countries is that going to green, and you can provide more opportunities for the job and also new development of technologies. So now the green is better and also more profitable than old steel and chemical industries. And also Chinese society is suffering from air pollutions, so that because of domestic pressures, government had to introduce massively renewable. But yet they had to maintain economic growth. They exporting coal power plant to the foreign countries. But if we change the model of the development, so that the positive way of showing that most advanced countries, US and Japan, European countries, show the new lifestyle. So not using plastics, not using big facilities, and then going to the more public transportation systems, and then bicycling and others, and EV cars, and also remodeling the urban setting, like I just said, the smart cities and also compact cities, everything in your hand, kind of reach on the walking distance and these kind of things. And also negatively, we can show you should not imitate us, because kind of a urban setting in Tokyo is terrible in terms of future major disasters. So we have to concern about, we try to disperse the major business and political centers, other cities, but there are lots of the resistance from the Tokyo governors, like former Ishihara governor, try to oppose any kind of relocation as part of the functions of the city. But now, so that we become very vulnerable urban setting. So China is kind of learning from the mistake of Japan, I guess. So maybe some other countries, India also can learn the major concentration of economic, political, facilities in Tokyo is a most vulnerable, environment we're creating. So I think negatively we can showing that other emerging economies do not imitate Japan. So this is another way, kind of showing this. The previous industrialization model is not working for the sustainable societies.
Well, I'd like to wrap up by saying that I really feel like we've had three panelists here with very disparate backgrounds, but I feel like we've turned into more than the sum of our parts, and so I'm very grateful for that. I'd also like to point out that we've really talked all day today about the fact that Asia may have the most to lose in terms of dealing with climate. There are a lot of states there that are very vulnerable. But there's also a lot of opportunities for cooperation here, not just on technologies that work, but also on kind of the soft infrastructure of climate change, on policies, on education systems, on the kind of things that can really help us move the needle on the climate. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists, and we thank you for coming out today.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.